My name is Doug Metzger. I'm one of the organizers of this festival and conference. Like any first-time event, it has involved a good deal of improvisation to keep it running, and unfortunately I haven't had a lot of chance to interact with people who have attended the event. A lot of us have been here for 2 days, Thursday and Friday already, and so most of the time I've been behind the scenes in the audio-video room and stuff, and kind of walking by talks and feeling a little bit sad that I don't get to attend them. And there have been a couple of stretches for me. At one point I was up for 47 hours, and there was a stretch where I had one meal in 3 days, and I'm actually still in that stretch right now. And so after this presentation, I'm going to go eat lunch and really not worry about the calorie count. So that's where I'm at right now, but still there is nowhere I would rather be and no people I would rather be with right now than you. This conference brings together the educational audio community, which is really in 3 parts: independent do-it-yourself podcasters like myself, professional radio people like Nate, and academics from whom we get our information and who also sometimes take the time to produce their own podcasts. And that's what makes it magical. So let me see. Even though it's been a heck of a few days for me, in some of the most hectic moments, I've been thinking about other independent educational podcasters that are not in a brightly lit room here at Harvard, but that are out in the rain somewhere, or maybe they're researching at lunch break in their car, or they're trying to record in the evening and trying to comfort their children while their baby starts crying in the middle of a take, and then on Monday morning going into work, because that's really what we do. So for all those folks who couldn't make it to this conference for whatever reason, I wanted to dedicate at least my portion of it to them. This is really the only part of the show where I get to be myself and talk about literature. I've moderated 2 panels and done an introduction and about 5,000 hours of other work, but this is my favorite part. So thank you so much for coming. I know it's rainy, it's difficult to find parking around Cambridge. I'm honored that you not only came to our festival, but to my little part of it. So my talk is called What English Departments Leave Out. Anybody in here fan of literature? I'm shocked. Okay, well, I'm less intimidated then. So, my show is called literatureandhistory.com, and I should say, in the midst of the whirlwind of the past few weeks of getting ready for this, unfortunately, I have not had time to memorize a 3,500-word speech, so I'm going to mainly be reading this as best I can. Anyway, my podcast is a show about thus far ancient literary history, from essentially the Bronze Age into the Roman Republic. And again, the title of my talk is What English Departments Leave Out, and it has a little bit of history about literature here at Harvard at the beginning that many of you are probably aware of. Here goes. A little over 180 years ago, a few hundred feet southwest of here, in the original Divinity Hall of Harvard Divinity School, which some of the events of the festival are held at, the American author and theologian Ralph Waldo Emerson delivered a famous and, in its own time, controversial address. The Divinity School address, as it's usually called, with its emphasis on individual revelation and on lived religious experience over time-worn liturgy and ritual. This address is one of the most optimistic and self-confident products of 19th century American culture. Christianity, an appropriate room for this, Emerson told this school's graduating class of 1838, Christianity was at its most powerful when it did not fall back on platitudes and did not burden itself with any meticulous fidelity toward historical creeds. Rather, Emerson said, experiencing the world, the grass, the flowers in a meadow, the conifers, and the songs of birds, Emerson said that this was also the experience of the divine. And any preacher who disregarded the astonishing variety of nature and his own lived experiences was not only tedious at the pulpit, he also missed out on a genuine connection with the divine. And Emerson was 35 when he gave this address over there, and at its core, there is a spirit of self-determination and intense curiosity. Early in the speech, Emerson wrote, quote, I would study, I would know, I would admire forever. These have been the entertainments of the human spirit in all ages. And this spirit of inquisitiveness that animated Emerson and his whole community, this is the same spirit that fills all of us who choose to spend a great deal of time studying something. Math, physics, chemistry, history, art, whatever it is, we become haunted with a curiosity to understand. And through our teachers, our interests are funneled into various subjects that we continue to investigate long after. Emerson's energetic curiosity lasted his entire life, and his unique strain of transcendental Christianity led him to read and travel widely up until his final years. In addition to the Bible and English literature, those staples of 19th century American letters, Emerson read a veritable who's who of figures from antiquity, too. Homer, Xenophanes, Plato, Plutarch, Lucretius, Juvenal, Horace, Sophocles, Euripides, and many more. However much Emerson read, though, a series of personal tragedies and a lifelong insatiability for learning left Emerson perpetually restless. And toward the end of his life, he recorded not satisfaction with his achievements, but instead a stricken awareness of how little he had managed to learn over the course of 70 years of life. In his late 60s, over 30 years after his boundlessly optimistic divinity school address, Emerson penned a melancholy passage about how many books he had not read. Emerson wrote in 1870 that, and you will understand and love this quote, quote, "We look over with a sigh at the monumental libraries of Paris, of the Vatican, of the British Museum. In 1858, the number of printed books in the Imperial Library at Paris was estimated at over 800,000 volumes, with an annual increase of 12,000 volumes, so that the number of printed books extant today may easily exceed 1 million. It is easy to count the number of pages which a diligent man can read in a day, and the number of years which human life in favorable circumstances allows to reading, and to demonstrate that, though a person should read from dawn till dark for 60 years, he must still die in the first alcove of the library." For all of us who love reading, these thoughts are something that we can relate to. That even if we pulled the throttle all the way back and somehow devoted ourselves exclusively to reading, even then we wouldn't even be able to get through more than a few drawers in the library card catalog. I think most of us here have felt something similar. We seek to learn as much as we can, but we run short on time and organization and memory. We try to build a dense body of knowledge, but we end up with something that looks more like a slab of burgeoning but ever moldier Swiss cheese. This, unless we are celebrity academics with a body of works that captures our entire history of learning, this is our plight. To read, to hold in our minds for a small and precious amount of time, and then, slowly, to forget. Most often, the imprints of things survive. The personalities and the events of the Napoleonic Wars, for instance, might fade away, but we remember a loose chain of events, bookended by approximate dates. As a friend of mine at this conference said, "We only have room for a certain number of penguins on our icebergs, and when new penguins climb up, other penguins that have been there for a while have to plop in and take a swim." I love that metaphor. In short, our curiosity, that quality so prevalent in the life and works of Emerson, our curiosity is far greater than the time that we have to indulge it, and our retention of information is insufficient for even the modest amount of reading that we're capable of. As an undergraduate English major, like maybe many of you here have been or are now, and many years afterward in graduate school in the same discipline, I thought about this a lot. While I took my undergrad classes and graduate seminars and later went through grad school exams and a doctoral dissertation, I never quite managed to throw myself single-mindedly into one time period. Particularly late in graduate school, it seemed like a crime to drill through onion layers of scholarly articles on the subjects of my own research when 5 feet away on the bookshelves there sat important and astounding works of world literature that I'd never cracked open before the age of 30. Proust, Thucydides, Gertrude Stein, the Icelandic epics, the Rig Veda. Was it really, I wondered, was it really wise to read so deeply in my area of research when on my bookshelves there sat the tantalizing and lush and largely unfamiliar expanses of the Quran and the Bible? And wasn't the latter book, in all likelihood, at least moderately more important to 19th century American culture, to the world of Emerson, than this or that school of postmodern period literary theory and its practitioners? Well, I happen to like literary theory just fine, and so I did what many young academics do. I tried to do it all. Daytime dissertation work was followed by nighttime forays into far-flung periods of literature. In the mornings, I debated with the existing body of scholarship in my field. In the evenings, I relished Homeric similes. I cried at the death of Dido and grimaced at the book of Leviticus and revered Rumi and giggled at Marie de France and marveled at the warmth and the lucidity of the Quran. I did other things too. Of course, grad school is hardly monastic isolation for anyone, really. I lived my life, tried to be a good friend and family member, and slacked off and ate junk food. But the main thoroughfare of my life, then as now, was literature. And as my doctoral dissertation transformed into a complex and difficult and ever more tempered argument, as I produced what I hoped would be a groundbreaking piece of scholarship, I realized that with literature, I didn't always want to break the ground. Often I just wanted to walk on it, reading and enjoying texts that generations before me had. I don't think that I'm alone in what I do, not at all. Many of us in education find that reading for purely research purposes, which is entirely necessary for the advancement of human knowledge, by the way, but many of us who work in education find that reading for purely research purposes is more of a process of tweezing and tabulating and sifting than enjoying. And in the midst of our projects, we seek things out to read, just for fun and personal enrichment. While everyone in academia has institutional incentives for esoteric research, I think most of us, or many of us, are curious generalists too, and we all feel perpetually humbled by all the fantastic things out there that we secretly haven't read and that our educations, for whatever reasons, omitted. To turn specifically back to English departments, maybe our club, what's left out varies from generation to generation and department to department and person to person. What was left out conspicuously for me was the ancient world. While I began my academic career with a PhD dissertation on 19th century American literature, I have spent the last 2.5 years with ancient literature, producing 125 hours of largely peer-reviewed podcast content totaling over 1 million words. Starting with Sumerian cuneiform in 3100 BC, from Mesopotamia through ancient Egypt, Canaan, and the ancient Near Eastern civilizations that were all rocked by the Bronze Age collapse, through the Greek Archaic Age, classical and Hellenistic Greece, Republican Rome, and the Roman Empire, it has been a long journey for my audience and I. And if anybody listens to my show, you know what I'm talking about. I mean here specifically. There's no way to concisely summarize the input that I've had from listeners over the course of 1 million downloads, which has ranged from erudite to warm and kind to funny to occasionally a little bit odd. But on my end, the most profound thing that's happened has been that the way I think about the ancient past and literary history has utterly changed over the course of my most recent project. When I finished grad school 7 years ago, there used to be a fog in my mind, a fog that stretched from Caedmon's hymn in the 7th century AD and backwards, more or less from there, excepting a few odds and ends I'd managed to squish in over the years due to a long-standing interest in antiquity. I knew my little cove of 19th century literature and philosophy well enough, but if you'd asked me, for instance, about Ecclesiastes or the Egyptian New Kingdom or the Babylonian epics or Ovid or ancient Greek tragedy, I'd have shrugged and said very little. For my specific literary education, the most significant element omitted was the Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Apocrypha, the Pseudepigrapha. Whatever your religious persuasions, these texts are woven together in various configurations to make up the most influential book on earth. And to my own period of historical specificity, again, 19th century America, which saw the Second Great Awakening exploding across the United States and bringing us modern Protestantism, the Bible was considered the beating heart of all the world's books. For Emerson and the major figures of the American Renaissance, from obscure geniuses like Dickinson to best-selling authors like Stowe, the Bible was, whatever idiosyncratic angle they had on it, the most important and dog-eared and disputed and indispensable text on the bookshelf. For the entire life of the English language, the Bible has been pervasive, influencing our cosmogony and our morality and our metaphors and the structure of our stories and our poetry, even the syntax of our sentences. By the way, I never thought I would say these sentences at a pulpit in a chapel. Anyway. And yet, we neither read it nor talked about it in the universities I attended. In a total of 11 years of undergraduate and graduate education, mostly on Anglophone literature, I never had a single word of Scripture as assigned reading. There are plenty of reasons for this tendency, not the least of which is that the Bible and the Apocrypha, even excluding the later pseudepigrapha, weigh in at over 900,000 words, or to us literature folks, 4.5 Moby Dicks. I know because I've released 24 hours of educational content on the Bible, and I still haven't yet begun my series on the New Testament. Another reason that the Bible has traditionally been excluded was perhaps that when English departments came into prominence during the middle and later parts of the 20th century, as secularization swept the modern university system, literature itself was slated to supersede the Bible and replace the theology of the Iron Age with a more diverse checkerboard of teachings pertinent to modernity. The Bible, however, has only been the beginning of my education's afterlife. My own journey into the ancient world over the past few years has involved personal discoveries that have made me wonder why it took creating a literature podcast in my 30s to learn things that ought to have come up freshman year of college. For instance, I read half a shelf full of classical feminism from Wollstonecraft to Woolf, but never learned that the first named author in the historical record, Enheduanna of Ur, was a woman who wrote poems in the southeast of modern-day Iraq, all the way back in the early 2200s BC. I didn't know that Enheduanna's goddess, Inanna, had an epic written about her that survives, an epic called The Descent of Inanna, which stars a plucky, willful heroine and is at least as old as Gilgamesh. I didn't know that a bevy of ancient Near Eastern cultures, Ugarit, Babylon, Hattusa, and Assyria, wrote stories and law codes that appear, sometimes quite unmistakably, in the Old Testament. And I didn't know, most simply of all, that the Old Testament is not particularly old, that it actually came about at around the halfway point of recorded history, rather than the beginning. So these factoids are like a highlight reel of information that went into the first dozen or so episodes of my show. And now there are nearly 70, averaging about 90 minutes each. Let's take a quick drink here. In writing literature and history, I have no sense that I'm outlining a canon in any novel or important way, or doing anything that's unavailable elsewhere. I have a sense, rather, like I think all the other foot soldiers and grunts of educational podcasting share, and that is that all educations leave things out, and that at a certain point in life we do not have the time or the vitality to devote weeks to extramural reading projects, and that nonetheless, to use a metaphor from earlier, we are at our best when there's a healthy flow of penguins on and off our icebergs. Over the course of producing my podcast, I have encountered, at this point, thousands of non-specialists interested in literature for the purposes of leisure and personal edification. They collectively find my podcast episodes in general to be useful bridges to often long and challenging primary texts. They, like all consumers of podcasts, they're commuters, and parents, and teachers, and runners, and long-haul truckers, and scientists, and engineers, and manual laborers, and students, and artists, and Uber drivers, and lawyers, and state workers. They're a group of people all over the world whose only commonalities are access to the internet and curiosity. They are not, generally speaking, young students ducking out of assigned readings, but instead working people who have had some exposure to literary history in the past and are working to fill in gaps in their knowledge. Folks who know that learning is healthy on both a personal and a societal level. In the very first episode of Literature and History, I lay out what I have always laid out for every course that I've ever taught anywhere, so I might as well do it here at Harvard too while I have the chance. And that is that reading literature is the search for both familiarity and for difference. All literature can fill us with fellow feeling. We can giggle at fart jokes and bathroom humor with Aristophanes and Chaucer. We can nod appreciatively at the subtle social observations of George Eliot and Henry James. We can read love stories in Sappho and Apollonius of Rhodes and Virgil and feel that having a crush on someone has been a remarkably similar experience throughout most of human history. But we can also go back to these very same figures and their respective time periods and find elements of their ideologies and social practices that are altogether different from ours. The Homeric hymns, the folk tales of ancient Egypt, the creation saga of the Hittites. These stories are not from our culture, and reading them invites us to ponder the mutability of humanity across the millennia. The more widely we can read cross-culturally and as academics, the more we can step out of the grottos of our research and into the exhilarating vastness of other fields and disciplines, the more we can become better citizens and better neighbors. At this whole conference, though, so far, and I've been here since early Thursday, I have heard a recurrent theme, a note of fear commingled with cautious optimism, and we heard it with Nate a minute ago. There are unsettling things going on in modern history. Tribalism and clannishness, which have been the Achilles heel of our species from the very beginning, are becoming political tools and exploding across contemporary democracies. We surf the internet using cookie-encrusted browsers that show us a digital reality catered to our preconceptions and our spending habits. We are invited, in spite of the diverse world in which we live, to hunker down amidst like-minded ideologies and reinforce one another's prejudices, fending off anything that challenges us with a swipe of the thumb or click of a mouse. Our news networks, sometimes quite overtly, assume a binary polity where pejorative assumptions about an outgroup stand in place of robust discussions of policy and legislative reform. There is no ready solution to all of this. And literature, but responsible, respectful educational audio can help. And literature itself, which has always taught us that humanity is a theme with variations, now has a new outlet to reach millions of new readers and remind us that today's sectarianism is as ugly and toxic as sectarianism generally is. Because I believe all of this, I'm trying to put a massive sampling of my language's literary history into one long, connected audio story. And as humble and imperfect and tawdry as my project sometimes is, I think it will be the best and most useful thing I'll be able to leave behind. When I first considered starting a literature podcast, I thought the whole thing sounded rather unnecessary. After all, weren't there already books on tape? And after that, books on CD that could be had for free at the library, and after that, LibriVox, and then outstanding MOOCs like the ones produced here at Harvard? Couldn't listeners just get a hold of an audible reading of an excellent translation of the Iliad? Well, they could. And if they happen to already know the layout of the Olympian Pantheon and dozens of prominent figures on either side of the Trojan War whom Homer's readers already knew about, and hundreds of other proper nouns and the prehistory of the Trojan War and the geography of Mycenaean Greece, and have a very good ear for complex poetic syntax, then maybe a 22-hour audio recording of the Iliad would have been a real hoot. But for the rest of us, for the uninitiated worker bees of the modern world who want to know more about the past, we need some assistance. And I, together with a very tiny handful of producers, are working together to package introductions and plot summaries and historical context and critical background into nice, punchy podcast episodes. Ones that sometimes touch people's lives, other times invite people to buy books and read them for themselves, and maybe most often hear great stories and enjoy them and slowly forget them amidst the rough and tumble of daily life. To return to Emerson, the sage of Concord once lamented that in the dizzyingly modern year of 1870, there were probably 1 million books in print. I have a feeling that there are a few more than that by now. And it would be wonderful if we could all read precisely the things that we wanted to read, pen and highlighter in hand, in a quiet and distraction-free environment. We can do this, and we should do it when we have the time and space, and I have a feeling that people in this room and in this building have done a great deal of it. But when time is short, whether we're tenured academics or have no formal education at all, educational audio shows can be a free and amply accessible gateway to rich and grand worlds of information that have nearly nothing to do with us or our politics or our preconceptions. And for whatever our English departments leave out, and all of them have to leave out a lot, whether you're a listener or an aspiring producer like me, literature podcasting is alive and open for business, and I could use all the help I can get. So thanks a lot, guys. It's 10:43. If anybody wants to walk to Dan's Carlin Talk with me, I would love to chat with you, but I have to run cameras over there, which is absolutely dreadful. The main thing I'm looking forward to at this conference is I get to talk to people in person and possibly meet a listener, and here we go, the whirlwind continues. So I can double up here for a second and show you guys how to get to Payne Hall if anybody doesn't want to or doesn't know how. Yeah, that's probably the one. No, that's the wrong one. Oh, thank you.